Today, I am seated here with Dr. George Michell on his lovely balcony in Goa, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the work of Johann Sebastian Bach and a book that you've written about him. What drew you to this project, and why did you end up writing a book about Bach?
It's a good question. And of course, having spent 40, 50 years studying the art and architecture of India, it's a perfectly reasonable question. The thing is that before I got interested in India, before I studied architecture, I studied music. I was the son of an immigrant German speaking piano teacher in Australia. And I was put onto the piano and then on the cello, and I was sort of quite cultured, but not super talented. So there was no question that I would have a professional music career. But what I was very good at was musicology, the study of music theory and music history. So all of this I did in my teenage years. Then I studied architecture, kept up music as an amateur, which I did in later years, went to India, discovered India, and traveled around India. When COVID came and other things happened and we could no longer travel to India, I was looking for something to do that wouldn't involve India anymore, would give me a sort of break. And I remembered my musicological background. And I had a mother who insisted that we play the music of Bach. And on Good Fridays, we would go to church and hear the passion music of Bach. Even though we had a vaguely Jewish background, it didn't matter. The music was the most important thing. So I reverted to this early interest. And I checked out the literature on Bach. Well, it's like a complete industry of scholarship. There was no way that I could contribute anything, really. But I was interested enough. And then I started investigating the influence of Bach. What happened to his music after he died in 1750, more than 250 years ago? How is it that his music has always been an inspiration to composers and musicians and performers right up to the present day? More so, I think, than any other composer of the past. I don't want to say that Beethoven isn't influential or Wagner, but today people still think about Bach when they are writing pop songs, doing electronic things, doing AI, instrumental music, and so forth. So there's a huge presence of Bach, not only in the concert hall, but also in composers' imaginations.
So, is who is the book for, really? Like,
Right.
is this only like something musicians can access? Do you need some kind of like grounding or training in music, or could I read it?
Well, I would like to hope that anybody who listens to music would pick it up and find it useful. It is actually designed as a guidebook. So it doesn't have an overall argument. It's not very dense in musicological technicalities. It would help if somebody had perhaps played the piano a bit. But there is a glossary to explain the terms. But my aim has been to alert readers about pieces of music they might not have known about. So I'm turning the readers into listeners. And these days, with the help of the internet, you can listen to everything. In the old days, you'd have to buy a CD, you'd have to source it and all that. But these days, in the book, if you come across a reference, I didn't know that Prokofiev wrote that. I didn't know Shostakovich did this. I didn't know that this pop group recorded a song which had Bach in it. You can immediately play it and listen to it. So this book is for people to dip into, not to read through, though it's arranged sort of chronologically, but it's not it's not been designed to be read as a continuous text.
Right. So it isn't like a biography of Bach at all, right?
Well,
Essentially.
it has I have a brief introduction. It starts with a chapter I've called Beginning with Bach. So at least I set out in about 8 or 10 pages the basic facts. Where did he live? When did he write what? Especially the pieces that are important for this book. That, when he was employed by a prince, he happened to write the Brandenburg concertos. When he wrote church music in Leipzig in his later years, he wrote the Passion music. They don't need to know much more than that, with a rough date, if we have a date.
Right.
So
Yeah.
and also with a catalog number, because every piece of music of Bach has a particular BWV number, they call it.
Okay.
And on the internet. If you put that number in, you get the piece of music.
Oh,
So as we're talking about the influence of Bach,
yeah.
I'm tracking which piece of Bach
Right.
influenced Peter, Paul, and Mary when they wrote their pop song,
Right.
or Jimi Hendrix when he did his improvisation,
Right.
or Mozart when he did I don't know what,
Right.
so that they can really go back to the bit of Bach
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was used by
Yeah.
these later people
Yeah.
and turned into a stage work, a pop song, orchestral work.
Yeah. Okay. Why Bach? I mean, you touched upon it a little bit earlier. That it's not that Beethoven wasn't influential or anything, but why specifically the works of Bach? Is it purely because he came earlier than some of these musicians that he has like this kind of an effect on musicians that followed, or is it the quality of work? Is it the ideas? What is it that's
Well, of course, he's earlier than Beethoven and Wagner, but there's something about the music that allows this. And this is the very difficult thing to explain, because we have to use words. And we are using words to describe effects in music. So we understand it when we listen to it,
right?
but we can't always explain it in words. But there are several factors about the music that has permitted this.
Mhm.
And one is that it's adaptable.
Okay.
So you can take a piece of music of Bach and you can play it on any instrument, like a synthesizer, electric keyboard. You can play it on saxophones. Doesn't matter what sound world you put the music into, the music survives. You can't do that with Wagner and Beethoven.
Right.
So it's adaptable.
Right.
It is inexhaustible.
Right.
It's indestructible.
Right.
And then the whole mechanism of the music, the structure, the mathematics, the rhythms of the music are all transferable. So, and that's something which people respond to. So when it's put into electric sound, it's still there.
Right.
And I don't think that's true for other composers. And that gave later musicians this huge flexibility. They could play around with Bach. They take a piece written for the organ in a church, take it and give it to a grand piano and put it in the concert hall.
Right.
It works.
Right.
Then they can take that and write it for, I don't know, string trio. It works.
Is this particular quality of Bach's music, the adaptability, is it a function of, I don't know, a willingness to experiment with newer and stranger sounds, I mean, or different sort of experiments with a specific instrument? Is there something like that?
Well, Bach himself did it in his day. And one of the big problems in his day was tuning the instruments.
Right.
So if you played a keyboard which had strings that had to be plucked, the harpsichord, each string had to be tuned according to a certain method.
Right.
And then that method allowed you to tune the next string.
Okay.
And so little by little, you went from one string to all the strings, but after a while, things got out of tune.
Right.
So you could play in a simple key, C major. You couldn't play in a complicated key, C sharp major. So Bach, he wasn't the only one, but he perfected this system of fine tuning. So adjusting very, very slightly. It was called tempering.
Right.
You slightly altered the strings, then you could play in all keys, which means you could move through all the harmonies freely.
Right.
And this, of course, had enormous consequence for later music. So his music looks forward in that sense. And according to many people who listened to Bach and wrote about Bach, they said the thing about Bach, it always sounds new. Everybody at the past used to think it was old-fashioned in his day, but now for us, it sounds always new, and it's always going somewhere. It's always doing something which we respond to.
Is there a piece of music of Bach that anyone would have listened to and not realized that it's Bach? And, do we have examples of that in popular media? Is that
definitely. Now, da-da-dum, da-da-la-la-la-dum, diddle-im, diddle-diddle.
Yeah.
Everybody knows this. It's in all sorts of, television, popular. And some people may know it's by somebody called Bach, but they don't know who Bach is.
Right.
They don't care, but it's very, very popular. It's like a signature
melody.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the fascinating thing about this bit from an organ work, there's some scholarly debate to see whether actually Bach wrote it himself. There's some
Right.
disagreement because it's so wild and improvisatory that they think it doesn't. But anyhow, we all accept it by Bach,
Okay.
and it has this rugged liberation about the music, this excitement,
Yeah.
and all sorts of pop groups have used it.
Right. Yeah. I first heard it in a cartoon when I was a child.
Oh,
You know.
yes,
So.
okay, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, back then I didn't know who Bach
No,
was
of
or
course,
anything. Yeah.
but it doesn't matter. Bach is not destroyed by it. He survives all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sort of speaks to the adaptability thing as well, right? Like
Right,
where
right.
you see it.
Because it's arresting. Da da dum, diddle diddle dee dum. It's such a fantastic stop, listen, alert. It's
Yeah.
got something about it
Yeah.
which immediately makes you want to listen to it.
So we've talked a little bit, about the music and the kind of qualities and what you know where we what Bach sort of might have experimented with and stuff. But is the adaptability factor, because that's one of those key things that you mentioned, is that only limited to sort of classical musicians, or you did say Peter, Paul, and Mary and Jimi Hendrix? Those are not classical musicians by any stretch
No,
of the imagination, right? So it seems to me like anybody can take Bach's music and do something with it. Is that fair to say?
it is fair to say, and that's what happened. People do, and they don't always do it with great respect, but they do it because it has an effect. We were talking about a television ad for a
Yes.
new cigar. And in these television ads, which were absolutely marvelous, done on British television in I think in the 80s, the people, the protagonists, they're little scenes of people who run into terrible difficulties. They get humiliated, they get distressed, and then they light up this cigar
Right.
to soothe themselves.
Right.
And in the background is the air on the G string of Bach. So this is the music that lulls them and accompanies their experience of smoking a cigar.
Right.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But in the 1940s, Walt Disney had the brilliant idea of doing an animated film on classical music.
Okay.
To bring classical music to a broad public.
Right.
People who don't listen to classical music.
Yeah.
And they started with da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum,
Yeah.
but not on the organ. Bach had written it for the church.
Right.
But there was an orchestration for a full orchestra by somebody called Stokowski. And he was a great showman. And he had a marvelous orchestra in Philadelphia. And he did all these adaptations of Bach for the orchestra. And therefore, he brought Bach into a popular audience sitting in the concert hall.
Right. Right.
Whereas Bach had written it for the congregation in the church.
Right.
So Bach starts to, and then of course, pop musicians like Jimi Hendrix, for goodness sake, they are playing or improvising on Bach for the pop stadium.
Right. Right.
So there are these different places where
football
Bach's
stadium or
football,
something.
God
Yeah.
knows what.
Yeah.
So Bach's music reaches, as one composer said, the music of Bach reaches all places, all times. It's always there.
Right.
And it doesn't sound old-fashioned.
Right.
And even if people have got no idea who he is or when it was written, they don't care because it still works.
Okay.
And one of the most famous pop songs of the 60s was called A Whiter Shade of Pale.
Yeah.
A famous pop song by Procol Harum starts with Air on the G string of Bach.
Right.
So it takes, the way in which it opens, and then it goes off on its own.
Yeah.
And they acknowledged that. They didn't pretend. They said, the songwriter said, we started with Bach and off we went.
Oh, okay.
So
it's a jumping off point for a lot of musicians, basically.
And even Hendrix, who wasn't, wasn't classically trained at all.
Yeah.
He even said, don't stick a psychedelic label around me, rather Bach.
Okay.
So, these people knew about Bach, and they knew about Bach because of his music, not because of academic or historic reasons.
Right.
The music still spoke to them.
Right.
So my book charts this experience.
Yeah.
Ever since after Bach died, all through the late 18th, into the 19th century, and so forth, and how people in different places, under different circumstances, kept on meddling, reusing, recycling Bach because it satisfied them and their audiences.
do we a lot of the examples that you have spoken about, from the sort of, for lack of a better way of saying this, Western music world, do we have any sort of examples of Bach's music being adapted to something outside that Western music tradition? And I don't necessarily mean a classical tradition.
No.
You've spoken about Hendrix. So outside of that sort of space, is there,
Well, first of all, there's jazz,
okay,
you
yeah,
know, which is, of course, Western in a way, or, you know, American. So
yeah,
there's plenty of jazz improvisations on Bach.
yeah,
And there was a French performer called Jacques Lussier who had a complete career on jazz Bach.
okay,
But meanwhile, Bach has been exported to Africa.
mm,
There's a marvelous African, a Gabonese
mm,
Bach project.
okay,
There is also a marvelous Arabic one by a group called Saraband, who are based in Germany, I believe, and they have done the Arabian Passion according to J.S. Bach.
oh,
And they have sung some of the arias and choruses in Arabic with Arabic musicians, and you know, the oud and the special sort of lute and Arabic violin, and it's absolutely wonderful. The quality of the music, the emotional impact of the
yeah,
music is by no means lost.
right,
So Bach is exportable,
right,
and one of the most extraordinary ones was the export to a cedar forest in Japan.
okay,
A mobile phone company
right,
wanted to promote a new type of phone which has a wooden cedar case.
right,
So they built this xylophone in a cedar forest in
okay,
Japan,
okay,
and when the ball went plop, plop, plop down the planks, it played Jesu Joy of Man Desiring, one of the famous songs of Bach.
right,
So they also used Bach. Now, okay, you can say it's irreverent, it's not, doesn't pay respect. But the point is, it works, it
right,
communicates, it attracts,
right,
it has a magnetism.
right,
And they could have chosen Beethoven and Mozart. They weren't committed to Bach,
correct.
but Bach worked for them.
Is there, I just want to go back a little bit to Bach's work and, his time making music. One of the aspects that we talked about was the adaptability in terms of, him having to tune or temper the instruments. So that gave him, possibly a little bit of not an advantage, but it perhaps made his work a little bit more adaptable. But is there, the settings that he performed at, were they all almost religious settings, or were there secular sort of spaces, and did that perhaps influence, the kind of music he created, and you know gave it that more adaptable space?
Well, you know, it's a good question. Bach found employment in different places,
Yeah,
and had to write music to suit his employer,
right,
naturally.
right,
He was an employed musician.
yeah.
There was
You
no
praise the
concept.
employer.
Yes,
Yes.
there was no concept of a freelance independent musician. That didn't exist in the 18th century,
Right.
not in Bach's time. So much of his career were in courtly settings. He had, you know, he was part of a court orchestra. He directed a court orchestra, and he had to produce music that was required for the court.
Right.
And much of this was entertainment music.
Right.
You know, music for formal occasions, for while they were having receptions. But they also had to produce royal music for the royal chapel. So there would be things for services for the king. And when the Elector of Saxony, who was the king of that part of Germany, died, and the new elector was, appointed, he wrote a sort of mass, like a funeral mass that began with a dirge, with a melancholy, sadness for the dead king, and then moved on to the Gloria with the glorious, optimistic music with trumpets and drums for the new king.
Right, right.
So later in life, when he moved to Leipzig, where he spent almost 30 years, then he was compelled to write music for the church. And every Sunday, he had to produce music.
That's quite demanding.
Yes, he produced more than 300 cantatas for church services, depending on that particular piece of the Bible that was read at that church service on that day.
Wow.
And we have this information.
Yeah.
And he also then wrote, for Christmas and Easter and for Good Friday, passion music.
Right.
But Leipzig was a commercial city. it was, and still is, a city which is renowned in Europe for one of the great fairs, because it's at the crossroads of different routes through north, south, and east, west Europe.
Right.
So it had a big commercial side, and there was an emerging middle class,
Okay.
a sort of bourgeois class.
Right.
And they wanted music for entertainment. They were not courtly, they were not royal, and they were outside the church. So they wanted entertainments, and these were held in coffee houses.
So this is like the merchant class, like
Yes, I mean
okay.
the middle class who had
Yeah.
who made money through commerce,
Right.
you
right.
know, and not through titles
Right.
and
yeah.
not through employment in the
Land,
church,
yeah,
but through
yeah.
their industry.
Yes.
And they wanted to have concerts.
For themselves, yes.
And in the summer, they wanted to sit outside the city in a coffee shop in a garden and have lovely music.
Yeah.
And so Bach directed, for many years, he directed these concerts. And so he wrote this secular music, these dance music, these concerto music in which people would show off on the harpsichord or the flute or
Right.
the violin. And he
Right.
wrote these Brandenburg concertos and other music which we know to entertain, to delight this audience. And he was very successful at doing that.
Right.
And then he wrote music privately for his own, entertainment, for his own interests.
Right.
And one of the most important experiences that Bach had, the highlight of his career, was that Frederick the Great, who was in Potsdam, in Berlin,
Yeah.
he was the most powerful king in Germany,
Right.
of the biggest and most richest state.
Right.
He invited Bach to his court.
Okay.
He was himself quite a good flute player, and he had a private orchestra. And in the orchestra, he employed one of Bach's sons. So this son told him all about his father.
Right.
And Bach had this fantastic reputation of improvising.
Okay.
And he was an organ repair expert.
Okay.
So every time in a church anywhere in Germany, they had a new organ, or the organ needed to be repaired, or there was some problem with the organ,
Yeah.
with the immense instruments,
Yeah.
Bach had all this technological expertise. He
Right.
would be called to give advice. This is what you need to do. Do this, do this, do this. He was paid for this, of course.
Of course.
And
yeah.
then he would show them how the organ sounded. And he would then perform on the organ,
Right.
improvise on the organ.
Right.
So he had a big reputation for this.
Right.
They didn't know his music, but they knew his improvisations.
Oh.
He was known for this. And so when he went to meet Frederick the Great, the king didn't ask to hear his music.
Okay.
They asked him to improvise.
Oh, I see.
You
Right.
see?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
this is, of course, what goes down into jazz and modern music. The fact that Bach's music that we have now seems to be a written down version of an improvisation.
Right.
So some of the music is structured so freely,
Yeah.
you think this is what Bach improvised, and he actually wrote it down.
Right.
So Jacques Lussier said, Bach's music works for jazz because in it is all these improvisation patterns.
Right.
So this would have been done in the church for people paying,
Yeah.
and was done for the king,
Yes.
and maybe it was done in
Even
the coffee houses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bach would sit down and play something, and then he would go off and,
Yeah.
improvise like a jazz musician.
Yeah, like an 18th century
Yes,
jazz
yes.
musician.
I mean, people did it in those days.
Yeah.
And he was famous for that.
So what are the sources that we're looking at, in your book when you're talking about, tracing the influence
Right.
of some of these pieces of music and his work? What kind of sources do we have that, gives us this information?
Right. Well, there's a huge amount written on the history of music.
Yeah.
So in it, you can read about these different musicians,
Right.
and then you can read about what did they write and which works maybe had an influence of Bach. So I was a sort of sleuth.
Right.
I had to go through this literature.
Right.
Some of it is quite well known, of course, but others were quite obscure, and we didn't realize that X did this, Y did that, and whether they said this or they didn't
Right.
say that.
And where did they say it?
Yes, and so I
Yeah.
had to source, where did Jimi Hendrix say this remark about Bach?
Right.
Because I
right.
had to say, in which, he had somebody who wrote his biography and recorded his sayings.
Mhm.
And then sometimes composers themselves say.
Yeah,
So there is a film composer called Morricone,
of course. Yeah.
Ennio Morricone, and he wrote for, many films. And for a particular French film, he wrote a theme based on the signature of Bach, da 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 da, which are the four notes that spell BACH in music in Germany.
Right.
And he called it Theme on the Name Bach.
Okay.
So he didn't pretend. He
it
didn't
was
conceal it.
Very transparent.
Yes, he said it.
Right.
There was nothing to be lost.
Right.
And it's a beautiful piece of music. So some things are out there. You easily recognize them. They are well known. Stokowski's orchestrations are well known. Other things are more obscure.
Mm-hmm.
How did Mozart find out about a Bach chorale,
Yeah.
when he never heard one?
Yeah.
Little problems,
Yeah.
which I've tried to solve, or other people have tried to solve.
And you trace the literature either when the musicians themselves say this is Bach, here you go,
Right.
and sometimes when it's just a nod to Bach's work, essentially.
Yes. So I mean, there's an enormous amount of published material, commentaries, program notes. Much of it is available on the internet. You can read about it. And of course, I even used a library, with actual books. And the one thing that helped me was that on the internet now, especially say YouTube, you have the scores.
Right.
You actually have the music itself, not
Right.
just the sound.
Right.
Now you see, as an architect, if you visit a building and you have the plan, you can look at the plan of the building and you're moving through the building.
Yeah.
The plan tells you the whole picture and you can understand how this room leads to that room and there's this and that. All this is clear. If you have the score of the music, it's like a plan.
Right.
You can begin to understand how it's put together.
Right.
And I'm trained to read that. But I don't expect the readers of the book.
Right.
They don't have to read it. I'm there to point out what matters, in my opinion.
Right.
And hopefully they can listen for themselves and see if they agree.
Okay.
Of course, I can't have every piece.
Right.
It's not possible. It's a selection. I have more than 300 separate pieces of music in this book.
Wow.
But there will be a reader who says, well, why didn't you put this in? And why didn't you have this? And I like this. Why? So I have to, a reader have to forgive me. Sure. Because it cannot be an encyclopedia.
It's not exhausting.
It cannot be.
Yeah. Okay.
Cannot be.
You've spoken a lot about modern day pop musicians, but you also touched upon people like Mozart being influenced by the works of Bach. So it isn't just Jimi Hendrix.
No.
Even the greats of classical music.
Yes, I mean, and the greats of classical music are great because they knew how to learn from the past. They were there to pick away and pick the best things and use it themselves.
Right.
There would be no point saying, I don't want nothing to do with the past.
Right.
I want to be completely contemporary. Didn't exist because music was a skill. There were ways of writing you had to learn. There were techniques. So you had to learn about the past, even if you didn't use it. And the interesting thing about Mozart, he was, as we know, an incredibly talented child prodigy.
Right.
And at the age of 9, the family went to London. And he took lessons from Bach, who he had no idea exactly. This was called Johann Christian Bach. And he was the big cheese in London in the 1760s.
Right.
So he was the big success. So Mozart went there and took lessons, and his early music, is influenced by J.C. Bach,
Right.
Johann Christian Bach.
So that's Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach's son.
Youngest son.
Okay.
But this son of Bach never said to Mozart, my father also wrote wonderful music. He just said my father was an old Whig, sort of dismissing him.
Right.
Because he wrote music completely different to his father.
Right.
So Mozart had no idea about this real Bach, what we call the real Bach. So then Mozart leaves his courtly employer and starts a freelance composer's life in Vienna. Right. And he was one of the first people to do this.
The freelance life.
And it was very tough. And in the end, it wasn't very successful.
Yeah.
He had a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
But, he was determined to get away and be free. It was part of his thing. So he goes to Vienna. And in Vienna, he is invited. He needs to meet, of course, rich and influential people to make contacts to get commissions.
Yeah, every freelancer knows this.
Yes, he had to network. No?
Yeah.
So he got invited to this aristocrat called Van Swieten. And this aristocrat was very interested in old music.
Okay.
And he had been in Berlin. He had met Frederick the Great. He had met another Bach son, and he gathered materials on Johann Sebastian Bach's music.
Right.
He brought it to Vienna, where nobody had any idea about Johann Sebastian. You see, because it was Catholic Austria. It was nothing to do with Bach, Protestant Germany. So Mozart goes eagerly, happily to these Sunday afternoons where they have food and drink, and they talk about music and they play music. And then he comes across Johann Sebastian Bach's music for the first time. He's already 25, 26. He's already written 25,000 operas and concerts. And, he's already a completely
Prolific,
developed,
yeah.
prolific, famous composer. He's not at the beginning of his career.
Yeah.
But he's learning.
Yeah.
And then he goes to Leipzig. He's passing through Leipzig on his way to Berlin for a commission. Doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But he goes to Leipzig and he plays on the organ of Bach. And then the people who are in there say, do you want to listen to some choral music? Because we are still singing some of old Bach's music.
Right.
And Mozart said, sure. So they perform. We know what they perform because somebody wrote about it later.
Right.
And Mozart is supposed to have said, here, at last, is something one can learn from. And he wasn't in a hurry to say that.
Yeah.
And then he asked to see the music, the written music. So he had the soprano music, he had the alto music, the tenor music, the bass music, all these different scores.
Correct.
Each singer was singing a different piece of music.
Oh, okay.
But there was no music showing it all together.
Right.
So he put it all on the floor and the chairs. That's what somebody said. And he looked at it all and
put it together in his head.
That's what we think.
I mean, yeah.
But see, Mozart is one of the towering figures of classical music.
Yeah.
And he was not very discreet and not very tactful. And when he heard music by his contemporaries, and he knew this music was worse than his, it was inferior, he couldn't always refrain from saying so.
Yes.
He wasn't flattering. He couldn't say, oh, it's marvelous. He would say, well, I can do better. And he could. He knew he could.
That's the popular version of Mozart as well that we have from
Amadeus, the movie. Yes. But the thing is, he did learn from Bach. And one of the first things he did for these Sunday matinees, he arranged some of Bach's music to be played by strings. He played the viola. Right. So for a group of friends, he arranged this music to be played so that he could actually perform it himself.
I see.
And of course, this process of doing this is a way of learning the music, of getting into the music, the logic, the inner structure.
Right. So, I mean, so basically we have even Mozart, who essentially is almost a near contemporary, not quite, I imagine, I think they did overlap.
No, Bach, he was born 5 or 6 years after Bach died.
Okay.
But say, as Mozart was discovering Bach,
right,
when he was 26 years old or whatever,
in
Vienna, this little boy in Bonn, in Germany, called Ludwig van Beethoven, was practicing Bach and he was just 10 or 11 because he had a teacher who made him practice.
Right.
So, and he learned it very well. And then when he came to Vienna, because that was the big city to make a career, where there was money and patronage, Mozart had already died. He didn't meet Mozart, but he could play Bach very well.
Right.
And he went to the same matinee, to the same count. He also needed to meet aristocrats. Money,
it's
people interested in music.
Same people with the money.
And he played, and this Van Sweden says, oh, you play Bach very well. And Beethoven played Bach very well.
Yeah.
And then he made Beethoven stay on in the evening.
Okay.
After everybody left, to continue to play.
Okay.
And then there was a student of Beethoven called Czerny. He noted how Beethoven played Bach, whether he played it quickly or slowly, or loud or soft. What he did with Bach's music, he edited Bach's music with Beethoven's playing instructions.
Right.
And I have that. I learnt my Bach with the Czerny edition with Beethoven's markings on Bach.
Oh.
So this shows you the interaction of the great musicians.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that everybody insists when you're learning that, you should play Bach, when you were studying.
Well, I mean, of course, there's the well-tempered clavier, which is a set of exercises in all the keys.
Right.
And this is considered the basic groundwork of keyboard technique, because it makes you play both hands. Okay. It's not like you play a melody with an accompaniment.
Right.
Each hand is doing something.
Right.
So it's control of the fingers.
Right.
It teaches you this.
Right.
It teaches you about harmony, and it teaches you about playing different melodies at the same time, which we call counterpoint.
Got it.
So all the structural components, like in architecture we say the structural elements,
right,
are there.
Right.
enunciated.
Right.
And you've got to master those if you want to write your own music.
Music.
It doesn't have, your own music doesn't have to sound like Bach,
Right.
but it has to have a structure. It has to have a logic,
Yeah.
and it's all there in Bach.
Understood.
And I don't think there's any composer who was really indifferent to that.
Got it. So when is this book out? When
Right,
can
right.
we?
Well,
where can we
I
buy it?
believe this book, which is called Back to Bach, a listener's guide, this will come out in, I believe, June, so the middle of this year.
Okay. Okay. And where could we pick it up if we need it?
Well, I mean, it's already advertised on Amazon.
Okay.
But whether it'll be on Amazon in every country of the world, I don't know. At the moment, it's on UK.
Okay.
Amazon, it will surely be in the US, of course.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. And well, thank you for that insightful conversation about Bach, about whom I barely knew anything. And hopefully, we get a copy of the book and can read through everything.
Well, I
that
hope,
we-
you and other people pick up the book, and then will discover things that they didn't know about, and maybe also to rediscover things that they did know about.
Yeah.
And it'll be a sort of an adventure. So
Yes.
there'll be known and unknown.
Yeah.
And that is my aim, is to alert people to music they may not have known about, can listen to, and maybe enjoy.
Right.
So it's this is my aim, and so my readers, I want them to become listeners.